Assalamu alaikum to all of my students. Hope you all are fine. Today I am going to discuss what we call excess demand and excess supply and excess supply. These are the two key concepts in economics: excess demand and excess supply. Generally, in previous lecture I discussed short-run equilibrium. At that time I tell you when aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply, this we call as corresponding to full employment level. Full employment, this we call equilibrium. This is called full employment level of equilibrium. Means when aggregate demand, for example, when aggregate demand is equal to 100 units, aggregate supply equal to 100 units, with respect to full employment level. Full employment level. Full employment, that is equal to 100. And when this situation happens in an economy, definitely we will call it equilibrium. But when this excess demand arises, simply when aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, corresponding to full level of employment. Means when aggregate demand is, for example, equal to 150 units, aggregate supply is equal to 100, corresponding to full employment level. Full employment, that is 100. Means here observe this, definitely this shows us aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. Means here is 150 units, here is 100 units, and add corresponding to full employment, that is 100. That means here it shows excess demand. Excess demand situation arises in an economy. What we call this full employment, as I tell you, this means land, labor, capital, they are fully employed. They are fully employed. That we call full employment level. Means when aggregate demand is above the aggregate excess कब arise हो रही है, जब होती है जब aggregate demand is above the full employment level, then at that time we will call it excess demand. I will show it with the help of graphical representation so that you can easily understand. For example, when aggregate, this is y, this is 0, this x, this is aggregate supply curve, this aggregate demand curve, this level of full employment, as I showed in previous lecture, this full level of full employment is the point of equilibrium. But when when aggregate demand is more than aggregate supply, this demand curve will shift upwards like this. This will become aggregate demand 1. Means when aggregate demand, as I show it, मैं आपसे कह रहा था, when aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, means aggregate demand now it is 50, 150, this is 100. That is why we call aggregate demand is now above the full employment level. Full employment level, that is equilibrium point. Now when aggregate demand curve shifts upwards, this gap comes into existence. This gap we will call inflationary gap. Inflationary gap in an economy. How it arises, as I tell you in previous lectures, aggregate demand, that is equal to C plus I plus G. C plus I plus G. Exports minus imports. G plus exports minus imports. This we call net exports. Net exports. Meaning when these variables increase, this will lead to create inflationary gap in an economy. One variable I will try to show you how price rises that leads to inflationary pressure, that leads to increase in, yes, that inflationary pressure in an economy. For example, consumption. Consumption. With respect to, we will take tax. For example, tax. When government declines tax, definitely it will increase the purchasing power of the people. Purchasing power of people. And purchasing power of the people, when declines tax, purchasing power of people will increases. Decline increases. Purchasing power of the people as tax has been declining. Now their purchasing power has been increased. Now they can demand more goods and service. More goods and service. As tax has been, their purchasing power has increased. Capability to buy goods and service, that increases. When they can buy more goods and service, when they demand more goods and service, this will lead to more demand. More demand will lead to rise in price at the marketplace. This is one of the factors we will consider it. Consumption. When government declines tax, this will lead to increase the purchasing power of the general population. General purchasing power of the general population increases. They will demand more goods and services. Definitely producer will rise its price. And when demand for goods and services increase, they will even rise its price. When this situation continues, remains prolonged period, definitely this will create an inflationary gap in an economy. Similarly, as government, as general, there are too many organizations like Apple company, Google company. They are investing in our economy. When they continue to invest, definitely time will come when demand will increase. When demand will increase, produce will rise its price, this will create an inflationary gap in an economy. Similarly, government is also investing in construction of roads, bridges, flyovers, health sector, education sector. When government invests, definitely this will lead to increase in demand. When demand increases, producer will rise its price with the perception. When this continues, definitely it will also become a reason to rise price that leads to create inflationary pressure in an economy. Similarly, exports and imports, this we call export demand. When we export continue goods and services, definitely this will lead to rise in price. When price increase, that leads to all these factors, all these components, C plus I plus G X minus M. When these increase for a prolonged period, definitely that will lead to create inflationary pressure in an economy. Similarly, opposite will happen. When these components decline, for example, when these components declines, consumption, investment go for a prolonged period, it will create a deflationary gap. Means demand curve will shift backwards like this. Aggregate demand 2 means aggregate demand curve will shift belowards, means below the full employment level. When this gap comes into existence, this gap we call deflationary gap. How it arises? As when these factors increase for a prolonged period, definitely that will create inflation pressure in an economy. When demand increases, that will lead to increase in price, that will create inflation pressure in an economy. When these factors decrease, definitely it will lead to decrease in demand. When decrease in demand, this will lead to fall in price. Definitely, when this remains continued, this will lead to create deflationary pressure in an economy. There will be deflation in an economy. या हम ऐसे भी कह सकते हैं. फॉर आई विल गिव यही एग्जांपल मैं यहाँ पे दे रहा हूँ आपको. फॉर एग्जांपल, इन केस ऑफ इन्फ्लेशनरी गैप, government declines tax, but when this deflation happens, government will increase its tax rate. When government raises its tax rate, definitely it will decline the purchasing power of the public. Purchasing power of public. Means they are now they have now capability to buy less goods and service. Less goods and service. And this will lead to create deflation in the economy or deflationary gap in the economy. When government, in case of inflationary, yes, government यहाँ पे government rise tax कर रहा है. And rise tax definitely will decline the purchasing power of the public. This will lead to less. They are now in such a situation they will spend less. They will buy less goods and service. And this will create deficient demand in an economy or deflationary gap in an economy. When this remains this for a prolonged period, this situation, this will create deflationary gap in an economy. How to correct this inflationary or deflationary gap in an economy? How to correct this inflationary or deflationary gap in an economy? There are two organizations like RBI and government. Generally, RBI uses it as CRR, cash reserve ratio. Yes. Bank rate, SLR, statutory liquidity ratio. Government uses it is tax policy, expenditure policy to correct inflation or deflationary gap in an economy. I will not discuss these variables, CRR, bank rate, how government, RBI government, as I have already discussed them. You can go through my YouTube channel. I have already discussed these concepts. How RBI control inflation or deflation gap in economy by way of these are the tools of monetary policy. These are the tools of fiscal policy. And these are the two instruments, monetary policy and fiscal policy, which government utilize in order to control inflation or deflationary gap in an economy. These two policies, monetary policy and fiscal, these I have already discussed on my YouTube channel. To understand the concept of how to correct inflationary gap and deflationary gap, you need to try to understand these concepts. You can go through these two videos, monetary policy and fiscal policy, to understand how inflationary and deflationary gap is corrected. I think it is enough for today. In coming lecture, I will discuss saving and investment, that are another concept related to short-term equilibrium of an economy. Till that time, hope for the best. Take care. Thanks. Have a nice day.